Section 6 of Lives of the Saints, with Reflections for every day of the year, by Rev. Alban Butler. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. March 1st. Saint David, Bishop. Saint David, son of Sant, Prince of Cardigan and of Non, was born in that country in the 5th century, and from his earliest years gave himself wholly to the service of God. He began his religious life under St. Paulinus, a disciple of St. Germanus, Bishop of Auxerre, who had been sent to Britain by Pope St. Celestine to stop the ravages of the heresy of Pelagius, at that time abbot, as it is said, of Bangor. On the reappearance of that heresy, in the beginning of the 6th century, the bishops assembled at Brevi, and, unable to address the people that came to hear the word of truth, sent for St. David from his cell to preach to them. The Saint came, and it is related that, as he preached, the ground beneath his feet rose and became a hill, so that he was heard by an innumerable crowd. The heresy fell under the sword of the Spirit, and the Saint was elected Bishop of Caerleon on the resignation of St. Dubricius, but he removed the see to Menevia, a lone and desert spot, where he might, with his monks, serve God away from the noise of the world. He founded 12 monasteries, and governed his church according to the canons sanctioned in Rome. At last, when about 80 years of age, he laid himself down, knowing that his hour was come. As his agony closed, Our Lord stood before him in a vision, and the Saint cried out, "Take me up with thee," and so gave up his soul, on Tuesday, March 1st, 561. St. Albinus, Bishop. St. Albinus was of an ancient and noble family in Brittany, and from his childhood was fervent in every exercise of piety. He ardently sighed after the happiness which a devout soul finds in being perfectly disengaged from all earthly things. Having embraced the monastic state at Tintolent, near Angers, he shone a perfect model of virtue, living as if in all things he had been without any will of his own, and his soul seemed so perfectly governed by the Spirit of Christ as to live only for Him. At the age of 35 years he was chosen abbot in 504, and 25 years afterwards Bishop of Angers. He everywhere restored discipline, being inflamed with the holy zeal for the honor of God. His dignity seemed to make no alteration either in his mortifications or in the constant recollection of his soul. Honored by all the world, even by kings, he was never affected with vanity. Powerful in works and miracles, he looked upon himself as the most unworthy and most unprofitable among the servants of God, and had no other ambition than to appear such in the eyes of others as he was in those of his own humility. In the Third Council of Orleans, in 538, he procured the 30th canon of the Council of Ebione to be revived, by which those are declared excommunicated who presume to contract incestuous marriages in the 1st or 2nd degree of consanguinity or affinity. He died on the 1st of March in 549. Reflection. With whatever virtues a man may be endowed, he will discover, if he considers himself attentively, a sufficient depth of misery to afford cause for deep humility. But Jesus Christ says, "He that humbleth himself shall be exalted." March 2nd. St. Simplicius, Pope. St. Simplicius was the ornament of the Roman clergy under Sts. Leo and Hilarius, and succeeded the latter in the pontificate in 468. He was raised by God to comfort and support his Church amidst the great storms. All the provinces of the Western Empire, out of Italy, were fallen into the hands of barbarians. The emperors, for many years, were rather shadows of power than sovereigns, and in the 8th year of the pontificate of Simplicius, Rome itself fell a prey to foreigners. Italy, by oppressions and the ravages of barbarians, was left almost a desert without inhabitants, and the imperial army consisted chiefly of barbarians, hired under the name of auxiliaries. These soon saw that their masters were in their power. The Heruli demanded 1/3 of the lands of Italy, and upon refusal chose for their leader Odoacer, one of the lowest extraction, but a resolute and intrepid man, who was proclaimed King of Rome in 476. He put to death Orestes, who was regent of the emperor for his son Augustulus, whom the Senate had advanced to the imperial throne. Odoacer spared the life of Augustulus, appointed him a salary of 6,000 pounds of gold, and permitted him to live at full liberty near Naples. Pope Simplicius was wholly taken up in comforting and relieving the afflicted, and in sowing the seeds of the Catholic faith among the barbarians. The East gave his zeal no less employment and concern. Peter Nephews, a violent Eutychian, was made by the heretics Patriarch of Antioch, and Peter Mongus, one of the most profligate men, that of Alexandria. Acacius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, received the sentence of St. Simplicius against Nephews, but supported Mongus against him and the Catholic Church, and was a notorious changeling, double dealer, and artful hypocrite, who often made religion serve his own private ends. St. Simplicius at length discovered his artifices, and redoubled his zeal to maintain the holy faith, which he saw betrayed on every side, whilst the patriarchal sees of Alexandria and Antioch were occupied by furious wolves, and there was not one Catholic king in the whole world. The emperor measured everything by his passions and human views. St. Simplicius, having sat 15 years, 11 months, and 6 days, went to receive the reward of his labors in 483. He was buried in St. Peter's on the 2nd of March. Reflection. He that trusteth in God shall fare never the worse, saith the wise man in the book of Ecclesiasticus. March 3.— ST. Cunigundes, Empress. St. Cunigundes was the daughter of Siegfried, the first Count of Luxembourg, and Hadeswige, his pious wife. They instilled into her from her cradle the most tender sentiments of piety, and married her to St. Henry, Duke of Bavaria, who, upon the death of the Emperor Otho III., was chosen King of the Romans, and crowned on the 6th of June, 1002. She was crowned at Paderborn on St. Lawrence's Day. In the year 1014 she went with her husband to Rome, and received the imperial crown with him from the hands of Pope Benedict VIII. She had, by St. Henry's consent, before her marriage, made a vow of virginity. Calumniators afterwards made vile accusations against her, and the holy empress, to remove the scandal of such a slander, trusting in God to prove her innocence, walked over red-hot plowshares without being hurt. The emperor condemned his too scrupulous fears and credulity, and from that time they lived in the strictest union of hearts, conspiring to promote in everything God's honor and the advancement of piety. Going once to make a retreat in Hesse, she fell dangerously ill, and made a vow to found a monastery, if she recovered, at Koffingen, near Cassel, in the diocese of Paderborn, which she executed in a stately manner, and gave it to nuns of the Order of St. Benedict. Before it was finished, St. Henry died in 1024. She earnestly recommended his soul to the prayers of others, especially to her dear nuns, and expressed her longing desire of joining them. She had already exhausted her treasures in founding bishoprics and monasteries, and in relieving the poor, and she had therefore little left now to give. But still thirsting to embrace perfect evangelical poverty, and to renounce all to serve God without obstacle, she assembled a great number of prelates to the dedication of her church of Koffingen on the anniversary day of her husband's death, 1025, and after the Gospel was sung at Mass, she offered on the altar a piece of the true cross, and then putting off her imperial robes, clothed herself with a poor habit. Her hair was cut off, and the bishop put on her a veil and a ring as a pledge of her fidelity to her heavenly Spouse. After she was consecrated to God and religion, she seemed entirely to forget that she had been empress, and behaved as the last in the house, being persuaded that she was so before God. She prayed and read much, worked with her hands, and took a singular pleasure in visiting and comforting the sick. Thus she passed the last 15 years of her life. Her mortifications at length reduced her to a very weak condition, and brought on her last sickness. Perceiving that they were preparing a cloth fringed with gold to cover her corpse after her death, she changed color and ordered it to be taken away. Nor could she be at rest till she was promised she should be buried as a poor religious in her habit. She died on the 3rd of March, 1040. Her body was carried to Bamberg, and buried near that of her husband. She was solemnly canonized by Innocent III in 1200. Reflection. Detachment of the mind, at least, is needful to those who can venture on an effectual renunciation. So likewise every one of you, saith Jesus Christ, that does not renounce all that he possesseth, cannot be my disciple. March 4th— ST. Casimir, King. Casimir, the second son of Casimir III, King of Poland, was born A.D. 1458. From the custody of a most virtuous mother, Elizabeth of Austria, he passed to the guardianship of a devoted master, the learned and pious John Douglas. Thus animated from his earliest years by precept and example, His innocence and piety soon ripened into the practice of heroic virtue. At the age of 25, sick of a lingering illness, he foretold the hour of his death, and chose to die a virgin rather than take the life and health which the doctor held out to him in the married state. In an atmosphere of luxury and magnificence, the young prince had fasted, worn a hair shirt, slept upon the bare earth, prayed by night, and watched for the opening of the church doors at dawn. He had become so tenderly devoted to the Passion of Our Lord that at Mass he seemed quite rapt out of himself, and his charity to the poor and afflicted knew no bounds. His love for Our Blessed Lady he expressed in a long and beautiful hymn, familiar to us in our own tongue. The miracles wrought by his body after death fill a volume. The blind saw, the lame walk, the sick were healed, a dead girl was raised to life. And once the Saint in glory led his countrymen to battle, and delivered them by a glorious victory from the schismatic Russian hosts. 122 years after his death, the Saint's tomb in the Cathedral of Vienna was opened, that the holy body might be transferred to the rich marble chapel where it now lays. The place was damp, and the very vault crumbled away in the hands of the workmen. Yet the Saint's body, wrapped in robes of silk, was found whole and incorrupt, and emitted a sweet fragrance, which filled the church and refreshed all who were present. Under his head was found his hymn to Our Lady, which he had had buried with him. The following night 3 young men saw a brilliant light issuing from the open tomb and streaming through the windows of the chapel. Reflection. Let the study of St. Casimir's life make us increase in devotion to the most pure Mother of God, a sure means of preserving holy purity. March 5th. Saints Adrian and Eubulus, martyrs. In the 7th year of Diocletian's persecution, continued by Galerius Maximianus, when Firmilian, the most bloody governor of Palestine, had stained Caesarea with the blood of many illustrious martyrs, Adrian and Eubulus came out of the country called Magantia to Caesarea, in order to visit the holy confessors there. At the gates of the city they were asked, as others were, whither they were going and upon what errand. They ingenuously confessed the truth, and were brought before the president, who ordered them to be tortured and their sides to be torn with iron hooks, and then condemned them to be exposed to wild beasts. 2 days later, when the pagans at Caesarea celebrated the festival of the public genius, Adrian was exposed to a lion, and not being dispatched by that beast, but only mangled, was at length killed by the sword. Eubulus was treated in the same manner 2 days later. The judge offered him his liberty if he would sacrifice to idols, but the Saint preferred a glorious death, and was the last that suffered in this persecution at Caesarea, which had now continued 12 years, under 3 successive governors, Flavian, Urban, and Firmilian. Divine vengeance pursuing the cruel Firmilian, he was that same year beheaded for his crimes, by the emperor's orders, as his predecessor Urban had been 2 years before. Reflection. It is in vain that we take the name of Christians, or pretend to follow Christ, unless we carry our crosses after Him. It is in vain that we hope to share in His glory and in His kingdom. If we accept not the condition, we cannot arrive at heaven by any other road but that which Christ held, who bequeathed His cross to all, His elect, as their portion and inheritance in this world. March 6th. St. Colette, Virgin. After her holy childhood, Colette joined a society of devout women called the Beguines, but not finding their state sufficiently austere, she entered the Third Order of St. Francis, and lived in a hut near her parish church of Corbie in Picardy. Here she had passed 4 years of extraordinary penance, when St. Francis, in a vision, bade her undertake the reform of her order, then much relaxed. Armed with due authority, she established her reform throughout a large part of Europe, and in spite of the most violent opposition, founded 17 convents of the strict observance. By the same wonderful prudence she assisted in healing the great schism which then afflicted the Church. The Fathers in council at Constance were in doubt how to deal with the 3 claimants to the tiara, John XXIII., Benedict XIII., and Gregory XII. At this crisis Colette, together with St. Vincent Ferrer, wrote to the Fathers to depose Benedict XIII., who alone refused his consent to a new election. This was done, and Martin V. was elected, to the great good of the Church. Colette equally assisted the Council of Basel by her advice and prayers, and when later God revealed to her the spirit of revolt that was rising, she warned the bishops and legates to retire from the council. St. Colette never ceased to pray for the Church, while the devils, in turn, never ceased to assault her. They swarmed round her as hideous insects, buzzing and stinging her tender skin. They brought into her cell the decaying corpses of public criminals, and, assuming themselves monstrous forms, struck her savage blows. Or they would appear in the most seductive guise, and tempt her by many deceits to sin. St. Colette once complained to Our Lord that the demons prevented her from praying. "Cease, then," said the devil to her, "your prayers for the great Master of the Church, and we will cease to torment you, for you torment us more by your prayers than we do you." Yet the Virgin of Christ triumphed alike over their threats and their allurements, and she said she would count that day the unhappiest of her life in which she suffered nothing for God. She died March 6, 1447, in a transport of intercession for sinners in the Church. Reflection. One of the greatest tests of being a good Catholic is zeal for the Church and devotion to Christ's Vicar. March 7th. St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas was born of noble parents at Aquino, in Italy, in 1226. At the age of 19 he received the Dominican habit at Naples, where he was studying. Seized by his brothers on his way to Paris, he suffered a 2 years' captivity in their castle of Roccasecca. But neither the caresses of his mother and sisters, nor the threats and stratagems of his brothers, could shake him in his vocation. While St. Thomas was in confinement at Roccasecca, his brothers endeavored to entrap him into sin, but the attempt only ended in the triumph of his purity. Snatching from the hearth a burning brand, the Saint drove from his chamber the wretched creature whom they had there concealed. Then, marking a cross upon the wall, he knelt down to pray, and forthwith, being wrapped in ecstasy, an angel girded him with a cord, in token of the gift of perpetual chastity which God had given him. The pain caused by the girdle was so sharp that St. Thomas uttered a piercing cry, which brought his guards into the room. But he never told this grace to any one save only to Father Reynold, his confessor, a little while before his death. Hence originated the confraternity of the Angelic Warfare for the preservation of the virtue of chastity. Having at length escaped, St. Thomas went to Cologne to study under Blessed Albert the Great, and after that to Paris, where for many years he taught philosophy and theology. The Church has ever venerated his numerous writings as the treasure house of sacred doctrine. While in naming him the Angelic Doctor, she has indicated that his science is more divine than human. The rarest gifts of intellect were combined in him with the tenderest piety. Prayer, he said, had taught him more than study. His singular devotion to the Blessed Sacrament shines forth in the office and hymns for Corpus Christi which he composed. To the words miraculously uttered by a crucifix at Naples, "Well hast thou written concerning me, Thomas. What shall I give thee as a reward?" he replied, "Not save thyself, O Lord." He died at Fossa Nuova, 1274, on his way to the General Council of Lyons, to which Pope Gregory X. had summoned him. Reflection. The knowledge of God is for all, but hidden treasures are reserved for those who have ever followed the Lamb. March 8th. St. John of God. Nothing in John's early life foreshadowed his future sanctity. He ran away as a boy from his home in Portugal, tended sheep and cattle in Spain, and served as a soldier against the French, and afterwards against the Turks. When about 40 years of age, feeling remorse for his wild life, he resolved to devote himself to the ransom of the Christian slaves in Africa, and went thither with the family of an exiled noble, which he maintained by his labor. On his return to Spain, he sought to do good by selling holy pictures and books at low prices. At length the hour of grace struck. At Granada, a sermon by the celebrated John of Avila shook his soul to its depths, and his expressions of self-abhorrence were so extraordinary that he was taken to the asylum as one mad. There he employed himself in ministering to the sick. On leaving, he began to collect homeless poor, and to support them by his work and by begging. One night St. John found in the streets a poor man who seemed near death, and, as he was wont, he carried him to the hospital, lay him on a bed, and went to fetch water to wash his feet. When he had washed them, he knelt to kiss them, and started with awe. The feet were pierced, and the print of the nails bright with an unearthly radiance. He raised his eye to look, and heard the words, "John, to me thou dost all that thou dost to the poor in my name. I reach forth my hand for the alms thou givest. Me dost thou clothe. mine are the feet thou dost wash." And then the gracious vision disappeared, leaving St. John filled at once with confusion and consolation. The bishop became the Saint's patron, and gave him the name of John of God. When his hospital was on fire, John was seen rushing about uninjured amidst the flames, until he had rescued all his poor. After 10 years spent in the service of the suffering, the Saint's life was fitly closed. He plunged into the river Canal to save a drowning boy, and died 1550 of an illness brought on by the attempt, at the age of 55. Reflection. — God often rewards men for works that are pleasing in His sight, by giving them grace and opportunity to do other works higher still. St. John of God used to attribute his conversion and the graces which enabled him to do such great works to his self-denying charity in Africa. March 9.— ST. FRANCIS of Rome. Frances was born at Rome in 1384. Her parents were of high rank. They overruled her desire to become a nun, and at 12 years of age married her to Lorenzo Ponziano, a Roman noble. During the 40 years of their married life they never had a disagreement. While spending her days in retirement and prayer, she attended promptly to every household duty, saying, "A married woman must leave God at the altar to find Him in her domestic cares." And she once found the verse of a psalm in which she had been 4 times thus interrupted completed for her in letters of gold. Her ordinary food was dry bread. Secretly she would exchange with beggars good food for their hard crusts. Her drink was water, and her cup a human skull. During the invasion of Rome in 1413, Ponziano was banished, his estates confiscated, his house destroyed, and his eldest son taken as a hostage. Francis saw in these losses only the finger of God, and blessed His holy name. When peace was restored, Ponziano recovered his estate, and Frances founded the Oblates. After her husband's death, barefoot and with a cord about her neck, she begged admission to the community, and was soon elected superioress. She lived always in the presence of God, and amongst many visions was given constant sight of her guardian angel, who shed such brightness around him that the Saint could read her midnight office by this light alone. He shielded her in the hour of temptation, and directed her in every good act. But when she was betrayed into some defect, he faded from her sight, and when some light words were spoken before her, he covered his face in shame. She died on the day she had foretold, March 9, 1440. Reflection. — God has appointed an angel to guard each one of us, to whose warnings we are bound to attend. Let us listen to his voice here, and we shall see him hereafter when he leads us before the throne of God. March 10.— THE 40 MARTYRS of Sebaste. The 40 martyrs were soldiers quartered at Sebaste in Armenia about the year 320. When their legion was ordered to offer sacrifice, they separated themselves from the rest and formed a company of martyrs. After they had been torn by scourges and iron hooks, they were chained together and led to a lingering death. It was a cruel winter, and they were condemned to lie naked on the icy surface of a pond in the open air till they were frozen to death. But they ran undismayed to the place of their combat, joyfully stripped off their garments, and with one voice besought God to keep their ranks unbroken. "40," they cried, "we have come to combat. Grant that 40 may be crowned." There were warm baths hard by, ready for any one amongst them who would deny Christ. The soldiers who watched saw angels descending with 39 crowns, and, while he wondered at the deficiency in the number, one of the confessors lost heart, renounced his faith, and, crawling to the fire, died body and soul at the spot where he expected relief. But the soldier was inspired to confess Christ and take his place, and again the number of 40 was complete. They remained steadfast while their limbs grew stiff and frozen, and died one by one. Among the 40 there was a young soldier who held out longest against the cold, and when the officers came to cart away the dead bodies, they found him still breathing. They were moved with pity, and wanted to leave him alive in the hope that he would still change his mind. But his mother stood by, and this valiant woman could not bear to see her son separated from the band of martyrs. She exhorted him to persevere, and lifted his frozen body into the cart. He was just able to make a sign of recognition, and was borne away to be thrown into the flames with the dead bodies of his brethren. Reflection. — All who live the life of grace are one in Christ. But besides this there are many special ties, of religion, of community life, or at least of aspirations in prayer and pious works. Thank God if He has bound you to others by these spiritual ties. Remember the character you have to support, and pray that the bond which unites you here may last for eternity. March 11.— ST. EULOGIUS, Martyr. St. Eulogius was of a senatorian family of Cordova, at that time the capital of the Moors in Spain. Our Saint was educated among the clergy of the Church of St. Zoilus, a martyr who suffered with 19 others under Diocletian. Here he distinguished himself by his virtue and learning, and, being made priest, was placed at the head of the chief ecclesiastical school at Cordova. He joined assiduous watching, fasting, and prayer to his studies, and his humility, mildness, and charity gained him the affection and respect of every one. During the persecution raised against the Christians in the year 850, St. Eulogius was thrown into prison, and there wrote his exhortation to martyrdom, addressed to the virgins Flora and Mary, who were beheaded the 24th of November, 851. 6 days after their death, Eulogius was set at liberty. In the year 852 several others suffered the like martyrdom. St. Eulogius encouraged all these martyrs to their triumphs, and was the support of that distressed flock. The Archbishop of Toledo dying in 858, St. Eulogius was elected to succeed him, but there was some obstacle that hindered him from being consecrated, though he did not outlive his election 2 months. A virgin, by name Leocritia, of a noble family among the Moors, had been instructed from her infancy in the Christian religion by one of her relatives, and privately baptized. Her father and mother used her very ill, and scourged her day and night to compel her to renounce the faith. Having made her condition known to St. Eulogius and his sister Annulona, intimating that she desired to go where she might freely exercise her religion, they secretly procured her the means of getting away, and concealed her for some time among faithful friends. But the matter was at length discovered, and they were all brought before the Cadi, who threatened to have Eulogius scourged to death. The Saint told him that his torments would be of no avail, for he would never change his religion. Whereupon the Cadi gave orders that he should be carried to the palace and be presented before the king's council. Eulogius began boldly to propose the truth of the gospel to them, but to prevent their hearing him, the councils condemned him immediately to lose his head. As they were leading him to execution, one of the guards gave him a blow on the face for having spoken against Mahomet. He returned the other cheek and patiently received a second. He received the stroke of death with great cheerfulness on the 11th of March, 859. St. Leocritia was beheaded 4 days after him, and her body thrown into the river Guadalquivir, but taken out by the Christians. Reflection. Beg of God, through the intercession of these holy martyrs, the gift of perseverance. Their example will supply you with an admirable rule for obtaining this crowning gift. Remember that you have renounced the world and the devil once for all at your baptism. Do not hesitate, do not look back, do not listen to suggestions against faith or virtue, but advance day by day along the road which you have chosen, to God, who is your portion forever. March 12.— ST. Gregory the Great. Gregory was a Roman of noble birth, and while still young was governor of Rome. On his father's death he gave his great wealth to the poor, turning his house on the Coelian Hill into a monastery, which now bears his name, and for some years lived as a perfect monk. The Pope drew him from his seclusion to make him one of the 7 deacons of Rome, and he did great service to the Church for many years as what we now call nuncio to the imperial court at Constantinople. While still a monk, the Saint was struck with some boys who were exposed for sale in Rome, and heard with sorrow that they were pagans. "And of what race are they?" he asked. "They are Angles." "Worthy indeed to be angels of God," said he, "and of what province?" "Of Deira," was the reply. "Truly we must rescue them from the wrath of God. And what is the name of their king?" "He is called Ella." "It is well," said Gregory. "Alleluia must be sung in their land of God." He at once got leave from the Pope, and had set out to convert the English, when the murmurs of the people led the Pope to recall him. Still the Angles were not forgotten, and one of the Saint's first cares as Pope was to send from his monastery St. Augustine and other monks to England. On the death of Pope Pelagius II., Gregory was compelled to take the government of the Church, and for 14 years his pontificate was a perfect model of ecclesiastical rule. He healed schisms, revived discipline, saved Italy by converting the wild Arian Lombards who were laying it waste, aided in the conversion of the Spanish and French Goths who were also Arians, and kindled anew in Britain the light of the Faith, which the English had put out in blood. He set in order the Church's prayers and chant, guided and consoled her pastors with innumerable letters, and preached incessantly, most effectually by his own example. He died A.D. 604, worn out by austerities and toils, and the Church reckons him one of her 4 great doctors, and reveres him as St. Gregory the Great. Reflection. The champions of faith prove the truth of their teaching no less by the holiness of their lives than by the force of their arguments. Never forget that to convert others you must first see to your own soul. March 13.— ST. EUPHRASIA, Virgin. Euphrasia was the daughter of pious and noble parents. After the death of her father, his widow withdrew privately with her little daughter into Egypt, where she was possessed of a very large estate. In that country she fixed her abode near a holy monastery of 130 nuns. The young Euphrasia, at 7 years of age, begged that she might be permitted to serve God in this monastery. The pious mother on hearing this wept for joy, and not long after presented her child to the abbess, who, taking up an image of Christ, gave it to Euphrasia. The tender virgin kissed it, saying, "By vow I consecrate myself to Christ." Then the mother led her before an image of our Redeemer, and lifting up her hands to heaven, said, "Lord Jesus Christ, receive this child under your special protection. You alone doth she love and seek, to you doth she recommend herself." Then leaving her in the hands of the abbess, she went out of the monastery weeping. Some time after this the good mother fell sick and soon slept in peace. Upon the news of her death the Emperor Theodosius sent for the noble virgin to come to court, having promised her in marriage to a favorite young senator. But the virgin wrote him refusing the alliance, repeating her vow of virginity, and requesting that her estate should be sold and divided among the poor, and all her slaves set at liberty. The emperor punctually executed all she desired a little before his death in 395. St. Euphrasia was a perfect pattern of humility, meekness, and charity. If she found herself assaulted by any temptation, she immediately sought the advice of the abbess, who often enjoined her on such occasions some humbling and painful penitential labor, as sometimes to carry great stones from one place to another, which employment she once, under an obstinate assault, continued 30 days, together with wonderful simplicity, till the devil, being vanquished by her humble obedience and chastisement of body, left her in peace. She was favored with miracles both before and after her death, which happened in the year 410, the 30th of her age. March 14.— ST. Maud, Queen. This princess was daughter of Theodoric, a powerful Saxon count. Her parents placed her very young in the monastery of Erford, of which her grandmother Maud was then abbess. Our Saint remained in that house, an accomplished model of all virtues, till her parents married her to Henry, son of Otho, Duke of Saxony, in 913, who was afterwards chosen King of Germany. He was a pious and victorious prince, and very tender of his subjects. Whilst by his arms he checked the insolence of the Hungarians and Danes, and enlarged his dominions by adding to them Bavaria, Maud gained domestic victories over her spiritual enemies more worthy of a Christian and far greater in the eyes of Heaven. She nourished the precious seeds of devotion and humility in her heart by assiduous prayer and meditation. It was her delight to visit, comfort, and exhort the sick and the afflicted, to serve and instruct the poor, and to afford her charitable succor to prisoners. Her husband, edified by her example, concurred with her in every pious undertaking which she projected. After 23 years' marriage, God was pleased to call the king to Himself. In 936, Maud, during his sickness, went to the church to pour forth her soul in prayer for him at the foot of the altar. As soon as she understood, by the tears and cries of the people, that he had expired, she called for a priest that was fasting to offer the holy sacrifice for his soul. She had 3 sons: Otho, afterwards emperor; Henry, Duke of Bavaria; and St. Brunn, Archbishop of Cologne. Otho was crowned King of Germany in 937 and Emperor at Rome in 962, after his victories over the Bohemians and Lombards. The two oldest sons conspired to strip Maud of her dowry on the unjust pretense that she had squandered the revenues of the state on the poor. The unnatural princes at length repented of their injustice and restored to her all that had been taken from her. She then became more liberal in her alms than ever, and founded many churches with 5 monasteries. In her last sickness she made her confession to her grandson William, the Archbishop of Mentz, who yet died 12 days before her on his road home. She again made a public confession before the priests and monks of the place, received the second time the last sacraments, and lying on a sackcloth with ashes on her head, died on the 14th of March in 968. Reflection. The beginning of true virtue is most ardently to desire it, and to ask it of God with the utmost assiduity and earnestness. Fervent prayer, holy meditation, and reading pious books are the principal means by which this virtue is to be constantly improved and the interior life of the soul to be strengthened. March 15.— ST. ZACHARY, Pope. St. Zachary succeeded Gregory III. In 741, and was a man of singular meekness and goodness. He loved the clergy and people of Rome to that degree that he hazarded his life for them on occasion of the troubles which Italy fell into by the rebellion of the Dukes of Spoleto and Benevento against King Luitprand. Out of respect to his sanctity and dignity, that king restored in the Church of Rome all the places which belonged to it, and sent back the captives without ransom. The Lombards were moved to tears at the devotion with which they heard him perform the divine service. The zeal and prudence of this holy Pope appeared in many wholesome regulations which he had made to reform or settle the discipline and peace of several churches. St. Boniface, the apostle of Germany, wrote to him against a certain priest named Virgilius, that he labored to sow the seeds of discord between him and Odilo, Duke of Bavaria, and taught, besides, many errors. Zachary ordered that Virgilius should be sent to Rome, that his doctrine might be examined. It seems that he cleared himself, for we find the same Virgilius soon after made Bishop of Salzburg. Certain Venetian merchants having bought at Rome many slaves to sell to the Moors in Africa, St. Zachary forbade such an iniquitous traffic, and, paying the merchants their price, gave the slaves their liberty. He adorned Rome with sacred buildings and with great foundations in favor of the poor and pilgrims, and gave every year a considerable sum to furnish oil for the lamps in St. Peter's Church. He died in 752 in the month of March. End of Section 6.